and welcome, folks, to Cookie Pocket, an attempt at a podcast, a show where three blokes talk about film. Zach, am going to be your host for this episode, but I'm joined by my fellow hosts, Christian and Mitchell, as soon to be always. And today we're going to be talking about The Changeling, a 1980 Canadian horror film directed by Peter Medak and starring George C. Scott as a composer whose wife and child are killed in a car crash, after which he moves into a supposedly haunted house. So I think just to start off with, we should kind of give our umbrella thoughts on the film, just kind of what we generally thought of it. So Christian, Mitchell, what did you guys think of the movie?
Well, Mitchell, would you like to go first?
No.
All right, I can go. It was not. I didn't particularly enjoy it. I really wanted to, and before I started watching movies with you, Zach, and movies that you've recommended to me, I was never sort of a horror fan, so to speak. It was a genre that I just thought wasn't for me, and like I had this general idea that I didn't want to be frightened or feel negative emotions when I'm watching a movie.
Mm-hmm.
And what really changed that for me was when you showed me The Thing and then the other John Carpenter movies that I really enjoyed, and to me are more than just, oh my God, I'm so scared right now.
Yeah.
So, where this movie kind of disconnected with me is the only part of the film to me that was horrific or frightening was something that horrified me to the point that I couldn't enjoy the way that it made me feel as an audience member, if that makes sense.
Uh-huh.
So,
okay.
And I, outside of the horror related comments, I said in my quick tweet review, should you all follow the links to our individual accounts, I said, I thought it was poorly edited. It felt like there was a ton of exposition. The plot felt flimsy to me, and I had a very hard time getting invested with the lead character, and I found him unemotional given his circumstances after the opening scene of the film. So the bright spots for me were I thought the score was great. It definitely worked well, and just the importance assigned to music in general in the plot and in the story enhances that much more so I thought that worked well, but overall I gave it a 1 out of 5. I guess it just wasn't for me.
All right. I'm glad you mentioned score, because I also was kind of really blown away by the score for this film, in particular kind of that central music box melody.
Mm-hmm.
I think is really effective at kind of packing those sad moments in the film. But Mitchell, what did you think of the movie?
Overall, in the beginning, I wasn't really too invested. I was kind of feeling like it was almost as bad, if not worse, than A Woman in Black, but I actually kind of like A Woman in Black.
Oh.
It reminded me a lot of it for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
But it kind of just...
The original or the remake?
The remake, actually.
Oh, okay. All right.
Clarifying. Yeah. But yeah, in the beginning, it kind of just felt like a cheap, cliche haunted house movie, and I was honestly really confused as to why where they were going with it. I thought the hook in the beginning, I guess, was all right. I think it was Pet Sematary-esque, if I remember correctly, the original, and I guess the remake. But I liked the punchy introduction, and the ominous build-up was really kind of pretty much carried by the score. In the beginning, I was like, okay, I was going to give it the benefit of the doubt pretty much. Was it Rick Wilkins that made the score?
Oh, I'm not sure. I can't remember.
Okay.
I think they said Rick Wilkins composed it and somebody else arranged and conducted the version of the music that they use in the film.
That sounds right, yeah.
Okay. But yeah, okay, there's like the piano playing by itself, like, oh, okay, wow, that was like, okay, what is that? And then the face in the water, I was like, I didn't understand at that point what that meant. Obviously, I figured that out later, why that was significant. But still, I was like, what is going on? Like, why are they doing the slow motion with everything where it doesn't even need to be slow motion? Like the lock, when he breaks the lock, I was like, let's just throw in slow motion here. I think that would be a cool, cinematography. I was like, this is really dumb, honestly. I was like seeing now overall, this is just not. And then he finds the book in the music box, and then pretty much from that point is when it kind of started to pick up for me. I'm not going to go into too specifics. We'll talk about that in a bit, but
Yeah.
in general, I think you really need to pay attention to the dialogue and really listen to what they're saying, especially when they're in the cafe, because I had to actually play that like 5 times over because the audio that I was hearing, I couldn't hear it very well. So I looked up the
Mm-hmm.
transcript just to make sure. But yeah, I really liked how it unfolded, and they had like the tiny foreshadowing in the beginning with the senator and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But overall, I mean, there was some really dumb cliche stuff that really hurt it and hurt the quality of it. But I think it was trying too hard to be a punchy horror movie when really it was kind of like a slow burn, like older fashioned kind of ominous type movie. If anything, I would say ominous probably describes it the most accurately. But I wouldn't say it was like super horrific. Besides the point that Christian mentioned with the bathtub. So, but yeah, overall, I really enjoyed it at the end.
Mm-hmm.
But it's mostly the beginning that hurts it overall.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the scene in the cafe, because I would definitely agree that if you miss the dialogue in that scene, you're going to be pretty lost when
Yeah.
it comes to the context of the haunting later on. The first time I watched it, because I watched this twice. I watched this 2 days ago, and then I rewatched it last night. The first time I watched it, after the film was over, I found myself thinking, okay, I know some kind of important information was given in that cafe scene, but I missed some of it, and so I was kind of lost. And I had to kind of look up the specifics of what had been said in that scene to figure out exactly what was going on.
Right.
In terms of my overall opinion, or Mitchell, did you have further thoughts you wanted to?
No, that's good.
Okay, all right. In terms of my overall opinion, I know that Roger Ebert, when he reviewed this film, said that technically it was a well-made movie, but that it sort of lacked that relation to the characters that makes this kind of movie scary. And I think I would definitely agree with that. I think this is a very well-directed and well-made movie. There are lots of nice little technical touches that I like a lot. Like when they're in the house, there's lots of follow shots in the hallways, and there's lots of high angles or high wide shots of the characters to establish like there's something else in this house watching them.
Right.
And I found that kind of creepy and effective. But as Christian pointed out, I think though I like George C. Scott as an actor, our central character here is so level-headed and so rational,
Right.
and so unfazed by what he encounters that it's difficult to become afraid or to be frightened by the movie, because our lead is never really all that frightened. So you almost feel like, well, why should I be afraid?
I personally like, not to interrupt you, but I personally like George C. Scott just because of the movies he's already been in. But I do when you like look over Clive Donner's A Christmas Carol, and I personally like that movie, and not nearly as much as most of the renditions of it, at least in film. But I think his personality really shows like in Patton, but specifically in A Christmas Carol, I feel like he's playing Scrooge in this pretty much. I feel like a lot of the personality traits in Scrooge, as him as Scrooge, plays into this, because the way that he reacts to all the hauntings and stuff in A Christmas Carol is dead on exactly the way he reacts in this, and they're two completely different. Like everything's completely different in this circumstance. So, so that's
there were
one
even
part.
aspects.
Yeah,
there were even aspects of the story, the type of haunting this is, that really reminded me of A Christmas Carol. Before we learn what the banging is, the banging in particular felt to me a lot like the scene in A Christmas Carol where all the clocks and bells go off in the house at once. That felt almost like a mirror image of something from Scrooge.
And during the seance, it's the return of the metal cone-shaped object shaking.
Yeah.
I was like, wow, that's like basically torn exactly from Christmas Carol. What was that, by the way? I know what it is in Christmas Carol, but what is it in this?
I don't know. I think it's an object that is actually kind of used by mediums in some cases, where the whole point is like, if there is a spirit in this room, it will move the metal triangle. So I think it's relatively accurate how they represented that. But yeah, it did seem a bit odd to me that the whole point, after they'd done the whole writing thing in the seance, that, well, we gotta get out the cone for actual confirmation that there really is a ghost.
No, Zach, wait, we have to end the scene in slow motion glass exploding.
I liked the glass, but I guess we'll come back to that later.
I actually like the glass too. I'll give you that,
liked
Zach.
it. It was kind of funny though.
Now, Christian, in your Twitter review, you mentioned you seem to take fault with this film almost on a moral level. If you could speak a little more specifically about that and kind of the scene that caused you to be sort of disgusted by the film.
Sure. And before I go in depth about that, I think it's important to acknowledge that as time passes, media is held to new standards, and recognizing that this, to some extent, is an older film, or at least didn't come out yesterday,
No.
it would be unfair of me to hold it to the same standard as I would a film premiering in theaters tomorrow, in theory, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll give it that much. But obviously, huge spoiler alert, but I think we're past that now. Is what really upset me was the scene where the child is being drowned in the bathtub. Like that, it's horrific and terrifying, yes, and it's a horror movie. But in terms of being frightened by a horror movie, there's a point at which I can no longer enjoy it, and I just at that point I'm realizing that children being abused and killed is a real thing that happens in the world, and it felt wrong to me to be entertained by something that was kind of a main theme. And I guess the redeeming quality of that is the main character is to some extent sort of fighting for some semblance of truth, I guess, or at least when he encounters a senator, he's trying to bring that truth to light, that this child was killed and was replaced, and his fortune isn't his. And so to me, that was sort of the only thing that made Scott's character interesting to me, or emotionally resonant, was that he was doing that.
Mm-hmm.
But I just, up until that point, up until that scene, I was not frightened. I was a little bored, honestly. And in the beginning sequence, when his wife and daughter are hit by the car, I didn't understand what happened at first glance. I was like, wait, did they just die? I had to rewind it, and I was like, oh, these cars are on the road.
There's like another car spinning. I was like, wait.
Yeah, it was shot in a confusing manner, yeah. and I feel like that's something that could have packed a much grander emotional punch if it was communicated in a more direct way.
I agree.
Yeah,
but
I do like how sudden it is, where it's like, and now it's happened. But I agree that it is kind of confusingly shot.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I mean, when I wrote that review, I was perhaps like at the peak of my emotional response to that film, and now that I've stepped away from it, I can be a little more qualitative about it. And I don't know. I think critically, what bothers me most about that scene is at least for me the only emotional factor into our main character, and this is probably my personal viewpoint speaking, but as a critic, I have a very hard time getting invested in something if I don't care about the character.
Mm-hmm. So. That's fair.
Yeah. Mitchell, what are your thoughts on the scene and the morality of including it, I suppose?
I think for the time, I feel as though as long as it's taken super seriously and it feeds into the plot very well, and I feel it's very integral in this case, then it doesn't morally bother me, in my opinion. I feel like I've seen enough movies from that time, specifically horror ones, where there's, the scenes like that are far, far worse. I mean, I understand like the kid thing. When you insert kids into it, it's a completely different moral plane, I do feel like. But in my personal opinion, it doesn't really bother me. I feel as though they took it seriously enough, and Scott had a good enough reaction to it. So, I mean, it didn't really morally trouble me very much.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I personally don't feel that the domain of, I guess the domain of like child murder or abuse should necessarily be off limits for a horror film, as long as it's dealt with in a serious way that addresses that it is an objectionable, awful thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this movie, despite some of its failings, still addresses that moment as a really terrible thing that's happened. Later, Scott's character calls it the worst kind of murder,
Yeah.
murder for financial
I wrote that
gain.
down. You're not Joseph
Yeah.
Carmichael. You're the beneficiary of the cruelest kind of murder, murder for profit.
Yeah, so I think that it does a good job of addressing that in a serious matter, but I can understand why that would be troubling to some viewers. Now, I wanted to point out... Oh, wait, Christian?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in on that quote. It's a very good line of dialogue, what he says there about the murder, but I found it a little bit troublesome that what made the murder the worst kind of murder was that it was for profit, not that it was murdering a child.
That's true.
Personally,
Yeah.
I think
That's
the child being the victim is a much worse part of that equation, but that's a small point. You can go on, Zach.
I hadn't thought of that, but that is a good point. I also wanted to address... last episode, I introduced this film as a cult horror film because it was my understanding that it was a movie that had a decent budget behind it, but didn't necessarily make that much of a splash when it came out and had kind of lapsed into obscurity. It turns out I was very wrong about that. This movie is kind of a critical darling. When it came out in 1980, it was nominated for 10 Canadian Academy Awards and won 8, including Best Picture, and it was nominated for 2 Saturn Awards in the United States, and it appears on both Martin Scorsese's and Stephen King's scariest movies of all time lists. So, based on that, and the fact that all of us sound it either somewhere from average to not that great, what do we think is kind of the factor of the film that led it to make that much of a critical splash when it came out? What do we think gripped audiences and critics in 1980 that's maybe not latching on to us now?
Oh, they killed my kid without saying sorry, eh? Oh, that's probably why. I have to say it's probably practical effects and a lack of actual like artificially inserted jump scares. I would say those two things, and that those are probably the main. I think those are the two main aspects, even though they're not really super. It's not. I don't think it's. I think it's less of a psychological thing. I think it's really just those two things. So,
I agree with both of those. I think I would say. I don't want this to sound like a lazy comment, but I do think it's true that audiences then are probably much more patient than audiences now. And that's probably partially why I gave it such a harsh rating initially. It was because I had difficulty getting invested. But I also think accomplished intellectuals like Scorsese and King have plenty of brain power and energy, and probably find a slow burn a lot more interesting and horrifying than something riddled with jump scares. So I think there's sort of a cultural sense in which critics hold those in a higher light, almost maybe to some extent because the layperson doesn't have the same patience that the critic does, if that makes sense. But maybe I'm extrapolating too much. I'd just say generally there's a patience differential in either time period.
right.
Yeah.
And this
I would say that...
Oh,
no, go ahead, Mitchell.
No, you go first.
Go ahead. Okay. I was just going to say, I feel like this film, at least when it came out, has sort of latent respectability in that it's so traditional, if that makes sense. This movie came out in 1980, which is kind of right on the brink of the traditional kind of ghost movies of the 60s and 70s and the slasher science fiction era of the 80s. So I feel like maybe there's a certain element of this is kind of I feel like it maybe almost has the air of like a historical drama nowadays, where it feels traditional, it feels gothic, it feels like something that has a lot of history and effort behind it, as opposed to kind of the newer thing that feels like today's news. But in terms, I don't necessarily think it deserves the 8 Canadian Academy Awards that it got, though I was shocked and fascinated to find that it did win that many awards, and I feel that it's an interesting film that's worthy of some praise, but maybe not quite that much. But Mitchell, what was it you were going to say?
I now I forgot.
Oh. Okay. Now, we've talked about our main character in this film, but I just wanted to talk about George C. Scott, our lead actor, a little bit more, setting aside maybe some of the negatives of his character or the way that his character's written. What do we think of his lead performance based on the material that he is given? Did you guys find him compelling or interesting as an actor, or what were your thoughts?
I don't feel as him independently encourages. I think taking how you worded that, how he takes with what he's working with and pushes it forward. I feel that's good. Like, he doesn't just carry the whole entire thing without the story. I feel as though he's definitely the driving force behind the actual story, and his best moments are when terrible, horrific things aren't happening, besides the kid dying. So basically, besides Joseph being murdered, every other part where it's supposed to be horrific but isn't, where the cliche points, those are his worst moments. But the dialogue and like the side thing, but like the breathing parts of the film are probably his best moments.
Okay, Christian, what did you think?
I have mixed feelings because I somehow got a very strong impression that he was a good actor, and that the decisions he made were deliberate, and he put thought into the way that he acted, which I can appreciate to a point. But I just feel like, given the opening scene and the point his character is at in his life, I just think there's so much there with what he has suffered through. And besides the one sequence where he's basically crying in his bed, that's really the only point in the movie where I get the emotion that I think his character merits after having suffered so much. And I also don't necessarily, I think a stoic approach can pay off, and a lot of ways in which you can communicate the grief, even if he wants to maintain that relatively unemotional outside appearance, especially when interacting with other characters. There were a lot of points in the film where it felt like, oh, if we could just have like 15 seconds of this quiet moment after this person leaves the room and it's just him.
Yeah.
It just felt like there were a lot of opportunities to just show him alone. Like, how would this character act if he was left alone with his thoughts? Just like give us like 30 seconds of that, and give us like a shot of his face. And there were, even outside of his character, I felt like there were certain points where something worked up to a certain point in tension, but it got cut away really quickly, and they didn't necessarily let things hang. And that's kind of where my editing comment comes from. But I don't know.
That's definitely reasonable criticism.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I actually think there's a deleted scene, or a little bit trimmed off of the scene when he comes home after he's tried to confront the senator and all the doors in the house slam. And he kind of is just yelling, like, "What do you want from me?" I've seen screenshots and little snippets of something that comes right after that line. Because in the movie, it's, "What do you want from me? I've done all I can do," and then it pretty much cuts. I've seen screenshots and snippets where he just kind of sort of collapses after that moment and just kind of sits totally destitute on the stairs, like he's completely drained, he's given all he's got to this, and he has nothing left. And I don't know if that was just cut out of the specific print we watched, or if it's a deleted scene from all versions, but I definitely feel that if we add more stuff like that, his sort of emotional arc, I think, would pack a lot more punch. Before going into this film, I kind of just knew George C. Scott as man who is angry in films, because his most well-known roles are kind of, Patton is sort of the big one, where he sort of plays this brash army general, and he swears and yells a lot. He's also in Dr. Strangelove, where he plays a similar kind of barking general role. But I did some research on him for this, and I found he's actually a really interesting actor. One of his personal beliefs was that all dramatic performances are unique, and therefore cannot be judged against each other. And he was the first actor to ever refuse the Academy Award for Best Actor. He won it for Patton, but he refused to accept it because of his philosophies, and when asked why, he said that the Academy Awards were a goddamn meat factory he had no interest in being a part in.
That's what Scrooge and Patton would say. That's the thing.
Yes, he kind of is this weird mix of like this Ebenezer Scrooge, George Patton type character. I think he's a fascinating guy, but I do agree that though a lot of the decisions made in this film feel deliberate, maybe not all of them quite work.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we've mentioned that none of us seem to find the film especially scary, but I did want to ask, do you necessarily think it was trying to be really scary? I'll hand that over to you.
I mean, it's difficult to say, especially because of the time period. Like, I was thinking, sometimes when I'm watching these movies, I'm thinking of, like, this typical 80s audience being all, like, frightened and everything. And I can't tell whether it's, like, my own mind making a cliche or it's, like, actually how they were. But I would say, I would feel like, okay, well, I'm not going to, like, go ahead of Christian because he had something planned later. But there's a barking wheelchair moment when Claire's just screaming maniacally and the wheelchair is barking at her, is what it sounded like to me. And I could do nothing but laugh at that moment. And I knew that was supposed to be absolutely hilarious. But it seems like that. The chandelier just starts shaking for no reason. Like, she just goes through all that. And then as he gets her out, the chandelier just starts shaking. And I understand that was, like, the lead up to the next scene. But, like, just that one moment kills that whole vibe. And I know they were trying to be scary in that moment. So I feel as though it's a mix. I feel like there's some where it's supposed to be ominous and more like build up, and then other points where it's supposed to be like immediately frightening, like the seance. So I think it's a mixture, ultimately.
Okay. Christian?
I'm going to throw it back to the hammer and lock scene that Mitchell mentioned earlier to answer your question. I don't know if you remember some of the directions that our old teacher and mentor, Mr. Rosen, gave us way back when we were theater whippersnappers in high school.
Uh-huh.
But whenever a character had to repeat the same phrase or the same word or the same thing, he would always tell us to do it differently every time, or to add some sort of variation to make it interesting and to make it engaged, because in many or most cases, it's more realistic for an individual to change the way they say something if they feel the need to repeat it multiple times.
Yeah.
And when Scott's character is just hammering away at the lock, and then they do they change the time, and it doesn't even look like he's actually trying to hit the lock. It looks like he's moving his arm enough so that the hammer makes contact with the lock, and then he does it.
And he swings with his other arm too. I thought that was weird. Like, who swings a hammer like that with both arms?
It was at that point where I was like, oh God, I have another hour of this movie. Like, I was just so out of it. And I don't know if that was necessarily meant to be scary, because this is at a point where the character is trying to find something and we're interested in what he's finding, but we're not necessarily about to get frightened by what it is, but we're gathering information at this point. And in any case, I felt like there was a little too much exposition for me to be frightened. And maybe that's what makes it a slow burn, and maybe in that sense it is deliberate. But for me, the lack of frightening sequences, at least until the end and the bathtub thing, it just took away from the film for me.
Okay, I would agree that this film, along with the critical acclaim, has a reputation as being like one of the greatest horror movies ever made. And a lot of scenes that people cite as being frightening, I wasn't especially frightened by. A big one that everybody's like, oh my gosh, it scared me so much when I saw it on TV, is the ball bouncing down the stairs. That didn't really get me.
Didn't get me
The first time I was a little, ooh, that's kind of creepy. But when he drives out, gets rid of it, and then comes back and immediately comes back down the stairs, I think it's too tightly packed together for it to be frightening. It feels more like, something in a comedic cartoon where the Wile E. Coyote falls off the cliff and then's back up at the top immediately. Then it feels like a scare. But I do think... Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Just real quick, I think my bigger problem with that, like you said, the way that the same ball dropping down the stairs action is repeated in rapid succession, that takes away from it. But what made it the mostly ineffectual for me is the fact that the second time it happens, as Scott is walking back through the door, he's just standing there, and we don't get any emotion from him as the ball comes down the stairs. At least not to me.
It's basically
He's
the same
just
scene
standing
again
there.
with the score being much more.
Yeah, he's only ever resigned. It feels to me, and that
Yeah.
just takes me out of any horror I'm meant to feel.
Yeah, I do think there are moments in this that, despite this film maybe not being all it's cracked up to be, I do think there are bits in this that feel very influential to me. The tape recorder scene after the seance, that really creeped me out.
Yeah.
And I guess it really creeped out M. Night Shyamalan as well, because he uses pretty much exactly the same scene in The Sixth Sense, when Bruce Willis is listening to old tapes and he finds a voice of a ghost on the tapes. So I do think this film definitely has had some influence on later horror films. The overall plot of we have to find a body in a well of a child,
The Ring,
is also used in The Ring
Yep.
and Ringu. So this film's definitely had an influence and frightened some people, but I feel like, aside from a couple moments, the Stairway of Fire, I think, is a little freaky. The actual payoff of the boy coming up through the floor, I didn't find all that creepy.
Right.
But just hearing about it, like when the mother describes a boy trying to come up through the floor,
She was a really good
staring at
actor.
her.
Mrs. Gray.
Yeah, I'm actually getting goosebumps right now thinking about that.
Yeah.
The
I
way
agree,
she
yeah.
describes that, I think that's great. The actual payoff is kind of, But I feel like there are little sparks of like, oh, I see what everybody saw throughout this movie, just sprinkled throughout. But I feel like a lot of it doesn't pack the punch that it used to necessarily.
Right.
And additionally, after this halfway point, after we see the wheelchair has rolled out and gotten to the top of the stairs and is kind of watching them, that's kind of the last scare until the very end of the movie, when everything kind of goes crazy. After that, it kind of becomes more of an investigative thriller, I think, than a horror film.
I
which I
definitely
think is
agree. Yeah.
a little bizarre, yeah. Now, I do want to additionally talk about the sets and locations. This is something that I think kind of creeped under the radar for me, but the house in this film is not an actual house. This house does not exist. All the rooms were sets, and the front of the house was a facade that they built on a pre-existing, just kind of like suburban-looking home. And I think,
That tells a lot.
it doesn't necessarily, save the movie or anything, but that's an impressive facade, and there are impressive sets in this movie, despite maybe
For sure.
the themes not working out all that well. That pretty much brings us to the end of my outlined notes. So I guess we'll go around to the kind of roundup segment you guys have planned. But first, do we have any thoughts, final thoughts we want to express, final opinions on the film before we go to the roundup?
I might have one more.
Okay.
I talked about how I found Scott unemotional, and that was the number one drawback for me. But I think plot-wise, the number one thing I don't understand is why doesn't he just move out of the goddamn house? Why? What reason does he have to stay there? Beyond there being a large room for a piano, which is an easily solvable thing if you're being haunted by specters
Find the truth,
and the
Christian.
ghosts of a murdered children.
Find the truth.
I do think it is kind of defined the truth, because
Yes.
this is another sort of fault with the movie, I think. But he does accept, this is a ghost, it's trying to contact me, I have to do something. He accepts that pretty quickly. So I think you can say the reason he's staying in the house is, well, I have to figure out what happened. But at the same time, I mean, he goes, ghost, I gotta help it, like, pretty quick.
Yeah.
There's a scene where he's like, well, maybe it's the piping, and then after it's not the piping, it's, well, it's gotta be a ghost.
It would have.
For all the
What were you gonna say, Christian?
I was just going to say, for all the exposition we get in the first half of the film, we can't get like a 1-minute scene of him reflecting on the memory of his daughter with that an understanding as to why he might feel sympathetic for the child.
Right.
Or it's very difficult to understand why this character is going through this hell after all of the things that he's faced prior to moving in here. And I just think there's, with the inciting incident at the start of the movie, there's so much opportunity to build up sympathy, both for Scott's character and for the child he's trying to help, I suppose. And for me, that just wasn't there.
And Claire.
For
What were you gonna say?
Go ahead, Mitchell.
Okay. Claire kind of tests his motivation in a way at that one scene. I don't remember when. I think it's after he gets the medallion. I think it's right after that. She's kind of
Oh,
like, why don't
he's
you just
washing
bring
his
this?
hands.
Yeah, and then she's
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
why don't you just bring this to the police? And he's like, no, it's not their job. It's me. I got to find the truth. And I was thinking, well, I can justify that in my own mind. That's because of his daughter in the very beginning. Obviously, I mean that's like that's like that's a thing. I mean that's the only thing that would possibly motivate him to stay there. But I would totally agree with Christian is that there with all that exposition and they still didn't really build up his character enough in that direction to give him enough motivation to actually follow through and go all the way to that random find the map and talk to that guy with the map and go to the house and literally live in the house for a night and then chainsaw into the well and find it and everything. I'm like, this is like I said, this is like Woman in Black. Like, why does Daniel Radcliffe have to freaking stay there? Like, there's no reason, but then I should say in the Woman in Black they have the actual physical, he's physically impossible, he has to stay there. So
Yeah.
there's that aspect, but I mean there's not even that in this. So I mean, that's my opinion.
Thematically, I think some of the disadvantages here come from the fact that this movie is based on a supposedly true story. There was a playwright who moved into a mansion in Cheeseman Park in Denver, Colorado, and he discovered apparently he discovered an empty room containing a child's wheelchair and a diary and a music box in the house. They had a seance. He was directed to a totally different house where they found a well containing a medallion supposedly belonging to this child that contacted them in the seance, along with some other possessions. So that's a creepy, supposedly, maybe, possibly not true story. And they thought, well, let's turn that into a movie. But I think where part of the difficulty comes in is, for the first half of the movie, they seem to want to go with a different ghost story. Because at first we think the ghost is this girl that was hit by the coal cart.
Right.
And if it was the girl that was hit by the coal cart, thematically it would line up so much better with Scott's story. Because he would have that relation to, my daughter died in a car crash, this girl was killed by a passing car.
Yeah.
They even mention it when they're in the graveyard, like, oh, it's the same.
Okay.
And then that goes nowhere.
Yeah.
So it does feel like maybe they were balancing, well, we want a thematic connection and we want the true story. Well, true story. We want both. I think they kind of tried to have their cake and eat it too, and it didn't necessarily work to its full extent. Any other thoughts?
I do feel like the most redeeming quality of the plot is the cafe scene, especially working out like how they replaced Joseph with the other kid, and they even mentioned World War One and like. The kid being sent, the replacement being sent there as if he was actually going to be cured when he came back, even though he was obviously fine, because the actual Joseph died, and then the senator reacting to all of that and just being an outright denial of it, but knowing deep down because of the duplicate medallion, which by the way is kind of a plot hole because why would they make a duplicate medallion in the first place and bury actual Joseph with it? That kind of didn't really work for me, but I felt as though it was justified considering how much work they were clearly putting into developing the story. So those are my final thoughts on the story.
Yeah, like I've said a couple times, watching this, I was really looking forward to this movie because, as I've mentioned, it has a big reputation, and I don't really think it's all it's chalked up to be. But I do think there are enough iconic, creepy sequences in there. The seance, the idea of the boy coming through the floor. I think the Stairway of Fire is a really nice, iconic moment. I think there are enough moments in there that I understand its kind of cult reputation. And it gets a 3 out of 5 okay, good to okay rating from me. But I guess I'll toss it over to you and Mitchell Christian for the final roundup segment, I guess.
Yes. So
this
was a
Christian.
segment. Yes.
I was about to say I'm gonna go based off of what you told me, because I felt as though anything else that I chose wasn't really going to be up to par with your list, and I feel as though 60 seconds.
Okay.
Thing. So
Perfectly fine.
I'm gonna go with what you said.
Okay. So Zach, we have a list of, let's just say things from the film, and we're going to yell them at you rapid fire, and you're going to give us a rating out of 5, similar to how you rate films you see. And I like to call this segment the rundown,
Oh dear.
as a sort of a all-encompassing finisher to an analysis of the film. So I'm gonna start the timer, and when I say go, Mitchell, you can read the first one, and then we'll alternate. Sounds good?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Alrighty.
Ready? Go.
George C. Scott as John Russell.
A 2 out of 5.
Doors that slam themselves.
4 out of 5.
That goddamned wheelchair.
3 out of 5.
Drowning children in bathtubs for entertainment purposes.
3 out of 5.
Trish Van Devere as Claire Norman.
3 out of 5.
An hour of exposition.
Disagree, but 2 out of 5.
A man that has endured unspeakable tragedy but is inexplicably unemotional.
2 out of 5.
The opening crash scene.
Oh, 4 out of 5.
Mr. Tuttle.
Mr. Who?
Mr. Tuttle.
Oh, 2 out of 5.
The groundskeeper.
Yes.
The score.
Oh, 4 out of 5.
John Russell's decision to stay in the house.
3 out of 5.
Oh, 2 seconds. Cinematography.
4 out of 5.
Yes.
Perfect. That was our whole list in 60 seconds exactly.
Wow.
Beautiful.
Nobody averaged that. It probably won't meet my actual rating.
That was really great fun. Thanks for putting up with us for that one, Zach.
I'm
Sure
I'm
thing.
going to give full credit to Christian for thinking of that idea. That's a really good idea.
Okay.
Thank you, Mitchell.
Well, as we bring this episode to an end, Mitchell, do you want to introduce what we're going to be watching for the next episode?
Austin Powers, International Man of Mystery. Because our access to it is going to be limited, so we have decided that is going to be our first Mitchell movie. So everybody will enjoy it and give it a 5 out of 5.
Okie doke. Well, this has been episode 2 of Cookie Pocket, an attempt at a podcast, and we've talked about the film The Changeling. I hope you enjoyed, and everybody, adios.
Have a good one.